Introduction. Hello there. Tom and Jerry. Thomas's Home Alone Adventures. Introduction. Hello there. This Tom and Jerry story is about Thomas being left home alone for a week. This story is very chill and the violence I normally add in stories is non-existent in this story. This is a second version of the story. Main characters. Grandma is an elderly lady. Thomas and Killer are Grandma's pets. Thomas is Grandma's cat. Killer is Grandma's loyal bulldog. Jerry is the little mouse who escapes Thomas every time. Butch is a cat and best friends with Thomas. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful morning in Utica, New York. Grandma and Killer are packing up for a one-week cruise so they can escape from Thomas's antics. A few seconds later Grandma hands Thomas $1,700 for the week. A few minutes later Grandma and Killer bitterly say goodbye to Thomas. A few seconds later the front door gets closed. A minute later Thomas watches a cab pick up Grandma and Killer. Thomas then takes out the $1,700 he got from Grandma for the week. A few seconds later Thomas looks to see what food they have. A few minutes later Thomas puts the money in his pocket. A few seconds later Thomas walks to a grocery store. 20 minutes later Thomas walks into the closest grocery store. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a shopping cart. 40 minutes later Thomas pays $374.76 for his week of groceries. A few minutes later Thomas gets a $20.50 Uber. 10 minutes later Thomas pays the driver $20.50 for the ride. A few minutes later Thomas starts to unpack his groceries. A few minutes later Thomas grabs a bag of chips and a 2-liter bottle of soda. A few minutes later Thomas starts making a plan for the $1,300 he has left. A few minutes later Thomas knows his plan, and not to waste the funds he has for the rest of the week. 2 minutes later Thomas starts raging at his Xbox. 2 hours later Thomas walks downstairs to cook pork chops for lunch. 20 minutes later Thomas tucks into some pork chops. A few seconds later Thomas answers a call he got from Grandma. A few minutes later Thomas ends the call. A few seconds later Thomas places his dishes from lunch into the sink. A few seconds later Thomas calls over his friend Butch. 20 minutes later Butch walks into the house. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch walk upstairs to play Xbox. 3 minutes later Butch and Thomas start raging their brains out at Thomas's Xbox. 10 minutes later Thomas and Butch walk downstairs. A few seconds later Butch leaves for the day. A few seconds later Thomas gets a text from Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas reads out the 340 chores that Grandma wants done by the time she is home. A few minutes later Thomas says he will do the chores later. A few seconds later Thomas lays on the living room sofa to take a nap. 2 hours later Thomas wakes up. 3 minutes later Thomas starts watching Jawtooth while drinking from a carton of milk. 20 minutes later Thomas decides to eat dinner, at a very early time. 15 minutes later Thomas watches Stampy Cat while eating an entire box of cereal. A few minutes later Thomas watches TV. 3 minutes later Thomas opens the front door to see Butch has returned for the night. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch watch Jawtooth. 15 minutes later Thomas says it is time for s'mores. A few seconds later Thomas grabs his least favorite book. A few minutes later the book is put ablaze. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch start cooking marshmallows. 20 minutes later Thomas extinguishes the fire. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch walk into the house. 4 minutes later Thomas and Butch get ready for bed. 20 minutes later Thomas and Butch fall asleep. 6 hours later Thomas and Butch walk downstairs. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch eat some cake for breakfast. 10 minutes later Thomas says goodbye to Butch. A few seconds later Thomas closes the front door. 1 minute later Thomas decides to tackle some of the 340 chores he has to complete in 5 days. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a bucket of soapy water. 5 minutes later Thomas starts mopping the water heater. A few seconds later Thomas screams with pure anger. 3 seconds later Thomas rips Grandma's mop in half. 3 seconds later Thomas then sees he has to mop the grass, clean the subatomic particles in the shower, vacuum the rocker arms in Grandma's Ferrari, polish the living room couch with a 2-inch drill bit, use a drinking straw to mop the ceiling, and to destroy the hornet's nest on the top of the chimney. Thomas then screams with pure anger. 1 second later Thomas grabs a flamethrower. 1 minute later Thomas sets up a very unstable 25-foot tall ladder to access the rooftop hornet's nest. A few seconds later Thomas starts ascending the ladder. 2 minutes later Thomas gets off the ladder. 1 second later the wind pushes the ladder. 1 second later the ladder crashes onto the driveway. Thomas then gulps because he is now stuck on the roof. A few seconds later Thomas starts to torch the hornet's nest. 2 minutes later all the hornets are dead and the nest is uninhabitable. A few seconds later Thomas then tries to think on how to get off the roof. A few seconds later Thomas gets the brilliant idea to jump off to the roof and into a bush. 10 seconds later Thomas jumps off the roof, directly above a bush of prickly thorns. 1 second later Thomas crashes into hundreds of prickly thorns. A few minutes later Thomas walks into the house with 58 thorns stuck in his body. An hour later Thomas finishes pulling out the thorns. A few minutes later Thomas finishes putting band-aids all over his body. A few seconds later Thomas decides to cook lunch. 10 minutes later Thomas gets a FaceTime call from Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas tells Grandma over FaceTime that he fell into her thorn bush after burning the hornet's nest with a flamethrower. A few minutes later Thomas ends the call. A few seconds later Thomas starts tucking into his 4-pound ham. 20 minutes later Thomas finishes eating his lunch. A few seconds later Thomas places his dishes from lunch and breakfast into the sink. 2 minutes later Thomas starts mega raging at his Xbox. 1 hour later Thomas walks downstairs to get a package. A few seconds later Thomas grabs the 4-pound package. A few seconds later Thomas starts to unbox his new Lego set. 10 minutes later Thomas walks upstairs with his new 5,000-piece Lego set. A few seconds later Thomas places the box in his closet. Thomas then calls Butch while walking downstairs. 10 minutes later Butch walks into the house. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch watch TV. 6 hours later Thomas and Butch eat some pasta. 20 minutes later Thomas places the pots and bowls from dinner into the ever-growing pile of dishes in the sink. A few seconds later Butch walks home. 10 seconds later Thomas decides to mop the grass. 2 hours later Thomas heads to bed after mopping the grass. 8 hours later Thomas wakes up. A few seconds later Thomas walks downstairs. 2 minutes later Thomas starts eating an entire box of cereal very quickly. A few minutes later Thomas watches TV. An hour later Thomas decides to tackle another chore. Thomas then decides to vacuum the rocker arms in Grandma's Ferrari. A few seconds later Thomas walks outside with Grandma's handheld vacuum. 3 minutes later Thomas starts to take random parts out of Grandma's Ferrari to access the rocker arms. 10 minutes later Thomas finally gets access to the rocker arms after dismantling 67% of the engine. A few seconds later Thomas starts to vacuum every square centimeter. 10 minutes later Thomas finishes vacuuming. A few seconds later Thomas calls Grandma to explain that he can't put the engine back together. 10 minutes later Thomas ends the call after getting a tangent of instructions. A few seconds later Thomas forgets every step. A few seconds later Thomas starts randomly putting the engine parts back into Grandma's Ferrari. 2 minutes later Thomas realizes he completely screwed up. 1 second later Thomas starts removing even more engine parts, making it even more complex to repair. 5 minutes later Thomas finishes removing everything except the transmission. Thomas then realizes his massive error. A few seconds later Thomas answers a FaceTime call he got. 1 second later Thomas shows Grandma the extent of the mess he made. 3 minutes later Thomas ends the call. A few seconds later Thomas calls Butch. 10 minutes later Butch arrives at the engineless Ferrari. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch start to repair the engine. A few minutes later Thomas and Butch realize they put in everything incorrectly. Butch then screams with anger. 10 minutes later the two cats finish taking everything out yet again. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch decide to do it very quickly. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch start randomly placing engine parts into the Ferrari. 20 minutes later they somehow manage to power up the Ferrari. Thomas then yelps with excitement. A few seconds later Butch leaves. A few seconds later Thomas walks inside to grab a drill. A few minutes later Thomas attempts to polish the leather couch in the living room with a drill bit. 10 minutes later Thomas finishes polishing all the leather. A few seconds later Thomas decides it is lunch time. A few seconds later Thomas walks to a buffet. 30 minutes later Thomas walks into the buffet. 20 minutes later Thomas pays $24.02 for his meal. A few seconds later Thomas walks home. 20 minutes later Thomas walks into the house. A few minutes later Thomas starts raging his brains out while playing Animal Crossing. 20 minutes later Thomas starts screaming very loudly while raging at the Animal Crossing video game. A few minutes later Thomas starts screaming slurs at his Xbox at very loud decibels. 10 seconds later Thomas gets a warning pop-up. Thomas then ignores it while screaming slurs. 10 seconds later Thomas gets an IP ban from Animal Crossing. 2 seconds later Thomas explodes with laughter. 10 seconds later Thomas walks downstairs. A minute later Thomas starts watching TV. 2 hours later Thomas decides to host a little get-together with his naughty friends. A few seconds later Thomas gets into a group chat with Topsy and Butch. 10 minutes later Topsy and Butch walk into Grandma's house. A few seconds later Thomas hands everyone a massive bowl of popcorn. A few seconds later Thomas and his friends watch X-rated movies. 4 hours later Topsy and Butch leave. 20 seconds later Thomas starts to cook dinner. 10 minutes later Thomas tucks into some pizza for dinner. 10 minutes later Thomas places a plate into the sink that is starting to overflow with dirty dishes. A few seconds later Thomas heads to bed. 10 hours later Thomas walks downstairs for breakfast. A few minutes later Thomas starts eating some cinnamon French toast pancakes for breakfast. 20 minutes later Thomas places his dishes from breakfast next to the sink, intentionally ignoring the ever-growing pile of dirty dishes that is overflowing the sink. A few seconds later Thomas walks away. A few seconds later Thomas decides to try to mop the ceiling with a drinking straw. 5 minutes later Thomas starts to clean the ceiling with 2 drinking straws. A few seconds later Thomas finds out the task is impossible. 1 second later Thomas gets his daily FaceTime call from Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas answers it. Thomas then explains the problem with the straw. 5 minutes later Thomas hangs up. A few seconds later Thomas decides to not do the chore. A few seconds later Thomas calls Butch. 10 minutes later Butch walks into the living room. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch grab $140 from Thomas's money stash. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch walk to Chuck E. Cheese's. 20 minutes later Thomas and Butch walk into the CEC. A few seconds later Thomas gives Butch $60 to spend. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch grab $60 worth of tokens. 5 minutes later they start playing arcade games. 2 hours later Butch and Thomas get their tickets turned into a slip of paper. 5 minutes later Thomas and Butch start spending their tickets. 20 minutes later Thomas and Butch order a $13 Uber. A few minutes later Thomas pays the driver a $7 tip. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch walk into Grandma's house for lunch. 10 minutes later Thomas and Butch tuck into some pizza rolls for lunch. A few minutes later Thomas places 2 dishes next to the sink. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch watch TV. 2 hours later Thomas and Butch start raging their brains out while playing Minecraft. 3 hours later Butch leaves for the day. A few seconds later Thomas starts to cook dinner. 20 minutes later Thomas tucks into some pizza for dinner. 8 minutes later Thomas places 4 dishes onto the dish pile. A few seconds later Thomas finally decides to wash the dirty dishes. A few seconds later Thomas starts to wash dishes and load the dishwasher. 10 minutes later Thomas starts a cycle on the dishwasher. A few minutes later Thomas watches TV. 20 minutes later Thomas does the second and final cycle of dishes. 20 minutes later Thomas starts to put away every dish. 10 minutes later Thomas heads to bed. 8 hours later Thomas walks downstairs for yet another day being home alone. A few seconds later Thomas gets a text from Grandma saying that the shed needs a deep cleaning. Thomas then sighs. 2 minutes later Thomas tucks into an entire box of cereal. 5 minutes later Thomas grabs cleaning supplies to deep clean the backyard shed. 10 minutes later Thomas arrives at the shed. A few seconds later Thomas opens the door. 1 second later Thomas gulps when he sees a massive pile of junk and broken stuff. A few seconds later Thomas sees yet another hornet's nest. 3 seconds later Thomas closes the shed. A few seconds later Thomas FaceTimes Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas explains what he saw. 1 second later Grandma tells Thomas to stop being a baby and deep clean the shed. 1 second later Grandma ends the call. A few seconds later Thomas puts on a hazmat suit. 1 minute later Thomas pokes the hornet's nest with a broom. 1 second later 752 hornets start flying towards Thomas. A few seconds later Thomas starts to lure the hornets into a metal box. 5 minutes later Thomas seals the box closed after all the hornets flown into it. A few seconds later Thomas drags the nest outside. 2 minutes later the nest is ablaze. A few seconds later Thomas watches the nest burn. 3 minutes later Thomas dumps cool water onto the nest. A few seconds later Thomas calls a dumpster company. 20 minutes later a roll-off truck arrives with a dumpster. A few seconds later Thomas pays them $500. A few minutes later the roll-off truck drives off. Thomas then starts throwing the stuff from the shed into the dumpster. An hour later Thomas finishes. A few seconds later Thomas grabs the garden hose. A few seconds later Thomas starts to hose down the shed. A few minutes later Thomas starts to clean the shed with a brush and soapy water bucket. 20 minutes later Thomas decides to dry the shed. A few seconds later Thomas starts to let it dry. A few seconds later Thomas walks over to Benjamin Moore. An hour later Thomas arrives home with 2 gallons of paint and a brush worth $50. A few seconds later Tom starts to give the shed a fresh coat of paint. 40 minutes later the shed starts to dry. A few minutes later Thomas starts to make additions inside the shed to surprise Grandma. 1 hour later Thomas finished putting up the additions. A few seconds later Thomas FaceTimes Grandma. A minute later Thomas shows off what he did to the shed, while Grandma praises Thomas for being a good kitty. A few minutes later Thomas ends the call. A few seconds later Thomas cleans up. 10 minutes later Thomas walks into the house for lunch. 20 minutes later Thomas tucks into some pasta. 10 minutes later Thomas washes his dishes and loads them into the dishwasher. A few minutes later Thomas watches TV. A few minutes later Butch walks into the house. A few seconds later Thomas says they have one more chore to complete. Thomas then says they have to clean the shower. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch grab cleaning supplies. 10 minutes later Thomas and Butch start deep cleaning the shower. An hour later they finish. A few minutes later Thomas and Butch watch TV. 3 hours later Thomas says goodbye to Butch. A few seconds later Thomas lays on the couch to catch some sleep. 15 minutes later Thomas wakes up. A few seconds later Thomas cooks dinner really early. 20 minutes later Thomas places his dishes from dinner into the dishwasher. A few minutes later Thomas starts a cycle on the dishwasher. A few seconds later Thomas walks down to the basement to do the laundry. 20 minutes later Thomas walks upstairs. A few minutes later Thomas plays some Minecraft. 20 minutes later Thomas heads to bed. 8 hours later Thomas wakes up. A few minutes later Thomas eats some cereal for breakfast. 20 minutes later Thomas watches TV. 1 hour later Thomas gets his daily FaceTime call from Grandma. 10 minutes later Thomas ends the call. An hour later Thomas walks into the kitchen to cook lunch. 10 minutes later Thomas eats some pizza rolls. 20 minutes later Thomas starts to play Xbox. 6 hours later Thomas eats dinner. A few minutes later Thomas watches TV. An hour later Thomas heads to bed after an uneventful day. 8 hours later Thomas wakes up for his final day of being home by himself. 2 minutes later Thomas tucks into an entire ham. 10 minutes later Thomas places his dishes from breakfast into the dishwasher. A few seconds later Thomas calls Grandma. A few seconds later Thomas says he is pumped for their return. A few minutes later Thomas ends the call after getting one last chore. Thomas was told he has to make sure everything is in tip-top shape. A few seconds later Thomas calls Butch. A few minutes later Butch walks into the living room. A few seconds later Thomas says he made a checklist. A few seconds later Thomas and Butch make sure everything is ready for Grandma and Killer's arrival in about 1 day's time. A few minutes later Thomas and Butch finish preparing for their arrival. A few seconds later Butch and Thomas watch TV. 2 hours later they eat some chips for lunch. A few minutes later Butch leaves for the day. Thomas then decides to get groceries for the family. A few seconds later Thomas grabs $300. A minute later Thomas walks to the grocery store. 20 minutes later Thomas arrives at a Stop and Shop. 2 seconds later Thomas grabs a cart. 20 minutes later Thomas pays $240 for the groceries. A few seconds later Thomas calls an Uber. A few minutes later the Uber driver helps Thomas place his groceries into the trunk. A few minutes later Thomas is driven home. 10 minutes later Thomas pays the driver $60. A few minutes later the driver speeds off, while Thomas unpacks the groceries. A few minutes later Thomas cuts the grass. An hour later Thomas walks into the house after doing some yard work. A few seconds later Thomas eats lunch. 10 minutes later Thomas watches TV. 7 hours later Thomas eats dinner. A few minutes later Thomas heads to bed after doing the dishes. 11 hours later Thomas eats breakfast. A few minutes later Thomas starts the final cycle on the dishwasher. 20 minutes later, Thomas dries and puts the dishes away. A few minutes later, Thomas knows that Grandma and Killer are about 2 hours away from arriving. A few minutes later, Thomas patiently waits outside for them. An hour later, Thomas gets a call from Grandma. A few seconds later, Thomas is told Grandma and Killer are about 20 minutes away. A few seconds later, Thomas ends the call. A few minutes later, Thomas grabs the $291.24 he has remaining. 5 minutes later, Grandma and Killer's cab stops in front of the house. A few seconds later, Thomas hugs Killer and Grandma. A few minutes later, Grandma and the pets walk into the house. A few seconds later, Thomas says Butch was a huge help with keeping up tidy and the chores. A few seconds later, Thomas hands Grandma the money he still has left. Thomas then says he went grocery shopping yesterday. A few minutes later, Thomas finishes giving Grandma and Killer a grand tour. A few minutes later, Grandma and Killer finish unpacking. A few minutes later, Thomas, Killer and Grandma peacefully watch TV. The end. Conclusion. Hello. I hope you enjoyed this tranquil Tom and Jerry story. More stories to come. Bye for now.